All right. Hello, everybody. It's about 6 o'clock on the dot, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight for part two of our local winter webinar series. Just taking a minute to get a little bit of learning in throughout the colder months. My name is Eliza Hensel. I'm the natural resource educator here at CCE Chautauqua. And I do ask that if throughout the presentation anyone has any questions, just send them into the Q&A feature, or hold them until the end of the presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end of this. So today we're going to talk about seed starting and garden planning. And it's kind of just to get some inspiration about the next season coming up, what to start ahead, what can get planted in the ground. Little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about tonight is one, knowing our local conditions. We talk about some garden planning goals, get some garden inspiration, looking at some different pictures, different layouts. Talk about companion planting and how to plant different plants together. And then we'll go into some seed starting methods and then go overview a little bit of final tips, takeaways, and as I said before, just hold on to questions for the end. So, most important thing, no matter what you're growing or where you're growing it, is knowing your local growing conditions. And there's that saying to put the right plant in the right place. A lot of problems in the garden can be avoided by putting the right plant in the right place. Even if you try everything you can, if it's the wrong plant and it's not meant to grow in a certain kind of environment, it's never going to be fully successful. So know what you've got and then work with that, and you're going to have a lot more success in the garden. Knowing our local conditions. One of the things you want to think about when garden planning and seed planning for the season is frost dates. So most of you who are been around for quite a while in the local area probably knows your conditions pretty well, but most of Chautauqua County falls into these hardiness zones of 5B through 6A. That's helpful to know for things like perennials and how quickly the soil warms up or how slowly it might warm up here. And so we want to think about frost dates as part of that. And what that means is just when are we done with our frost season and when can certain plants be planted in the ground outside. So the last spring frost is typically around early to mid-May. So this is going to be when we can put stuff in the ground out there. And then the first fall frost is what to look out for those later summer crops or fall crops. And that's typically around early through mid-October up in this region. So that gives us roughly 150 to 165 days frost-free, which is plenty of time to grow things in the garden, but it's not enough time to totally skip planting. Thinking ahead a little bit will help save some headache and get the most out of your season. So this is a map of the total US showing these different hardiness zones. And a lot of that follows through on just where the wind currents come, what kind of environments we have, mountains, plains, whatnot. And so falling into a little bit closer where we are, you can see that we get a little bit of that 5B and that 6A. We really fall between that category. So that's helpful to know for what? Well, sometimes when you're shopping for seeds, it'll show a graph on the back of the seed packet, and that will have to do with planting times, whether or not you should start indoors or plant direct sow, and then how to coordinate that dependent upon your hardiness zone. So if you're not sure what to do with seeds and timing, start by looking at the back of the seed packet and checking for whatever timing it says for zones 5B to 6A. So another important thing to consider is your own space. How many hours of sun does your yard actually get? Some places get 6+ hours, and that would be considered full sun. Anything less than 6 hours of full sun in a day, and you're probably going to have partial sun, is what you would categorize that at. Or you might not get any sun in the backyard. And that still doesn't mean you can't grow anything. It just might not be the best space to put full sun necessary plants. What kind of soil do you have? Are you doing in containers? Do you have loamy, clay, very sandy soils? Some people can have a variety of these all on the same property too. What kind of drainage do you have? Is it a very dry area? Is it a low spot that tends to pool water? And then you want to also think about wind exposure and water access. So if there's a really strong wind coming, is there something you can put up to create a barrier to protect more sensitive plants? Or where are you getting your water? Do you have water access out there? These factors are all going to shape what you can or should grow and where to grow it. And so we also want to define your own garden goals when you're planning for your garden. Just because someone else is growing a whole row of cucumbers and tomatoes doesn't mean that that's what you should grow if you don't actually want to eat those. So sometimes I see people try and grow things just for the fun of it, and that's great too. But grow what you actually want to eat. And then also consider how much time can you realistically spend out in your garden. Certain plants are a little bit more high maintenance. Others don't mind being left alone. Those are also things to consider when you want to talk about the long-term success of your garden. If you're planting more high maintenance crops or more sensitive crops, those might require a bit more time out in the garden. And if you don't have that and you still want a successful summer and a harvest, maybe consider more low maintenance hardy plants. And finally, are you growing for fun, for food, or are you just growing for beauty? There's also plants that solve multiple of these problems, kind of like nasturtiums. You can grow them for the beauty of the flower and you can eat them. Same goes for a lot of squash that has big flowers in the beginning of the season before they put out their fruit. So you can do multiples of these and achieve the same thing. So now I'm going to talk about choosing crops that thrive here. So there's different kinds of crops depending upon what time of year it is. So there's some cool season crops. These are good for spring and fall as the season's kind of waning in and waxing out. Things that are going to go well during the cool season would be lettuce, spinach, peas, radishes, kale, broccoli, and carrots. All of these varieties are a little bit stronger to tolerate those chilly soil temperatures, and these can be planted early or again as an end of season, depending upon which one you're working with. And then we also have warm season crops. So these are good to go out after those frosts are no longer of any concern and it's the heat of the summer. So tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, those are all going to do really well in the warm season, as well as basil, squash, beans, and corn. These need warm soils and they need warm nights. So these are definitely more of the warm season crops. We'll talk more about temperature when it comes to germination as well. And so just some tips to remind yourself for our shorter growing seasons, because we do have a colder climate than some areas. We have a little bit less time in the season to grow than other places of the country, say those down in the south. So we just want to be smart about making our decisions in the garden to get the most out of our season. And by that, we could do things like choosing early maturing varieties. Also, you can use row cover for season extension. You can build low tunnels or cold frames to protect from temperatures. And we can start fall crops in midsummer to make sure we can extend our harvest window. So when it comes to designing, our garden layout, we want to think about a few different aspects of the garden, both the functionality, the appeal, and then how it works for you. So I like to recommend that you think about putting tall crops like tomatoes, pole beans, or trellised cucumbers on the north side so that they don't shade out some of those smaller crops. Think about the angle of your yard, the direction of the sun coming in and out every day, and put those taller crops wherever they're going to be able to still receive that sun, but not blocking something out. So maybe for you that's not the north side of the yard, but the idea here is to put them in a place where you're going to still be able to expose the smaller plants as well. So by doing that and grouping plants by their sun needs and their water needs, they're naturally going to be in an area where they'll be able to thrive instead of competing with each other. So that might be important to think about if you were to have a very drought hardy plant next to something that's really thirsty and needs a lot of water. You wouldn't want to plant those next to each other and then have a dueling environment where two plants need different amounts of water but are in the same bed. We also want to leave space for pathways in the garden. You will definitely thank yourself later once the plants start filling in. And then it also just saves out some time on weeding by doing things like you see in this photo with a layer of mulch or sawdust laid out throughout the tracks. Not only does it make it look nice, but it also tampons out the weeds in a whole section of the garden, gives nice spacing to your plants, and allows room for airflow and room for yourself to navigate your own garden. And finally, think about adding things with flowers like marigolds, calendula, or zinnias, not only for pollinators to help attract more beneficial pests, but also to outbalance some of those bad pests by having the good ones around. Again, like I said, things like nasturtium could also do that, and they're edible, but it adds a little bit of beauty, color, and some beneficial insects and pollinators, which we always want around. All right, so when it comes to garden planning principles, there's five top things to consider there. One, we want to think about crop rotation. So by doing that, you can avoid planting the same family in the same bed year after year. Some of those roots, excuse me, will remain in the soil and rot down. And we want to increase the biodiversity. We want to move what we're growing year after year to just mix things up in the garden and prevent recurring pests or problems by having the same thing in the same place every year. Another tip is succession planting. So using interplanting to extend our harvests. So things like some of our leafy greens are great to do succession planting. And by that, I mean waiting a few weeks between your planting windows. And by doing that, you'll extend your harvest window. If, say, every 2 weeks you plant another head of lettuce or another row of arugula, say, then you'll have extended harvest windows so you're not harvesting all of the entirety of the crop at the same time, and it's too much to eat in that moment. Another thing to think about is spacing optimization. So each variety of plant or vegetable is going to vary depending on how much space it needs. Always check your seed labels for the maximum size of the plant, whether that's height or the width of the canopy of leaves. Something like carrots might not have as much horizontal space, but they might need space vertically for their greens to grow, versus a squash plant might need quite a bit of space between each plant, as those leaves and vines can get very big. We also want to integrate cover crops. Now, I'm not going to recommend just one over any other. People have their own opinions on what cover crops they like to use and the benefits of different cover crops, but by integrating cover crops into our garden, we can help keep moisture in the soil, we can help reintroduce biodiversity into our soil, and also some of those can be beneficial for eating or harvesting as well as helping protect the ground. And then just think about resilience strategies. So essentially making the garden work best for itself, right? Thinking about water efficiency. How much cover mulch do you use in the garden? By putting mulch around the base of plants and in the garden, that can help keep soil moist. It can help dampen out weed coverage. Having efficient irrigation throughout the garden can keep a constant level of moisture in the soil as well for optimal plant growth. And so just thinking for the long run for plant success. All right, so I have a few photos on the next couple of slides, just to get some garden inspiration. I know when I'm thinking about planting my garden every year, I always like to look around online, see what other people are doing, see if there's any fun creative ideas I haven't thought of before. So both of these show raised beds, a little bit varying scales. So, the one on the right is a little bit more of a fancy raised bed. We've got gravel pathways with pavers. It looks very nice. Looks like that could be an urban community garden. It's got a beautiful archway. And many of these things you can get for pretty cheap. You can find them used. Places like Facebook Marketplace, I always recommend people look for gardening supplies, or any of your local hardware stores. And the one on the left is essentially the same thing, but a little bit simpler. We've got some low beds, but they're containing the soil, lots of flowers and things for pollinators to come by, lots of color, and thinking everything of the generally same height is kind of planted there with each other. It's a little bit more of a lower accessible garden. And we've got this one here, getting a little creative with how we're planting. Looks a little bit more artistically designed. I think this is really beautiful. The different colors of lettuce heads, I'm not sure how they got that so perfect, but I think that is just so cool. And there's lots of natural materials being used here. So our trellising is made mostly, it looks like, of wooden sticks, branches, kind of arched throughout as a gate. That could be a great way for peas or beans or something else to trellis up that. And there's still walkways, but it looks like in this one they've just dampened out the weeds and made the walkway paths with some old straw. And so that's another great option to use. That'll break down, that'll just add more texture and organic matter into your soil over time, and it'll help delineate those pathways a little bit. All right, this next one here, we have some more arches. I think these are such a great way to make your garden look a little bit more stately, established, and it provides an awesome way to get really great airflow around plants that need to be trellised as well. Airflow is really important for stuff with a lot of foliage. You don't want the leaves to stay damp and moist. You want to have the roots getting the water and the leaves to be nice and dry and accessing as much sunlight as possible. So I always love some kind of archway for a really densely foliated vining plant. Things like green beans would do really well on that. And one more here. So we've got some leafy greens on the bottom. Looks like we have a few things that are flowering that might attract some pollinators. Got some straw or hay delineating the pathways here. Have a bird feeder for a little water feature, bring the birds in. Always a good idea. Compost bin in the back. And then seems like they're using some cattle panel here for um, the archways. And it's a great way to make an archway super flexible, easy to do yourself, and then zip tie down with some stakes. It's nothing fancy, but it gets the job done. And then once plants would fill that up and grow over and vine, you wouldn't even be able to see the structure underneath and you just see all that foliage. So things to think about and just hopefully provide everyone with a little bit of inspiration there for some designs. Get you guys thinking. So five things just to take away from that part of that is to one, always leave room for walkways. Makes it a lot easier and more enjoyable to navigate your garden. Cattle panels or creative ways to make archways. Great way to get some extra space and airflow. Raised boxes versus in-ground planting. It depends on what kind of soil you have on your property and what you prefer, what's more accessible for you, and also it's just a matter of cost and what you want to invest into the garden. We also want to think about grouping by sun and water needs. So, like I said, if you have a plant that likes to be a little drier, you wouldn't want to put that next to a plant that needs a good soaking and a good watering very frequent. And same thing goes for plants with their sun. Some things like full sun, some like partial, or even like in the shade. Also, things that are taller might shade out some smaller plants. So just considering where you put those based on what the final life stages of those plants are going to look like and what they need. And so that leads me into our next bit, which is companion planting. So certain plants can help each other thrive when paired together. But like I said earlier, we want to avoid overcrowding and we want to avoid pairing them with ones that they won't be compatible with. So some pretty classic pairings that people have heard of most likely are tomatoes with basil or marigolds nearby. That might help boost pollinators and possibly deter some extra pests. Another pairing is carrots and onions being planted together. Some things have said that their scents might help to confuse each other's pests. They also have relatively the same size as leaves and foliage while the roots are growing down underground, so they're compatible at least size-wise. And then another pairing is cucumbers and dill or nasturtiums. And so those are going to help attract beneficial insects. All of those would have flowers at some stage in their life cycle. And of course, there's many more pairings. Those are not all of them, but just a few to get you guys thinking about that. Another classic pairing when it comes to companion planting is a Three Sisters garden. And so the Three Sisters is a Native American tradition of corn, squash, and beans all being planted together in the same space. And so the three of those are going to work in hand in different ways to help the other plants thrive. And at the end of it, you're going to get three different kinds of food to harvest, which is a wonderful thing, of course, as well. So the beans are going to act by fixing nitrogen and supplying it to the soil. Those are always great to have growing around your garden. The corn growing up, once it has this, enough of a body, would provide a stalk for those beans to climb. So that's going to give those beans the trellising structure that they would naturally need. And then by putting squash in that same garden, you're going to have the broad leaves growing off that squash. And those are going to do a couple of things. One, to help shade the soil and prevent evaporation, therefore decreasing some of that weed competition with shade. But by doing the chop and drop method right there in the garden, you also have all of that natural mulch that can be added back into the soil. So by chopping off the leaves at the end of the harvest, at the end of that plant's life cycle, and then just dropping them there in the garden, they'll break down naturally over time and add more organic matter into your soil. And sometimes it's not about pests or what plants deter others' pests, but simply what works well together and what might pair well spatially. So finally, with companion planting, we also want to consider the biology of the plant. So not only the height, but what about the root system as well? You wouldn't want to put a bunch of deep-rooted plants all next to each other as they'd be competing for space down underground. But if you have a row of deep-rooted plants, maybe you could put some more shallow-rooted plants next to them over space, and therefore their roots wouldn't be competing necessarily in the same area. Another way to compare them is by their growth window. So a more slow growing plant next to a faster grower. That way you could have, for example, lettuce growing on the surface of the soil next to a row of tomatoes or cucumbers. That might take a little bit more time to get their full, to get the fruit off the vine and to harvest them. All right, and so now from here, we're going to get into a bit of seed starting. We'll talk about direct sow versus what to start ahead. So, why might we want to start seeds indoors? Well, it's going to extend our short growing season. It's also going to give us access to more varieties that might need a little bit more care or time to get established, or things that might need a longer growing season. You could start them ahead. But it's going to help you save money potentially in the long run. Generally speaking, buying a package of seeds is much cheaper than buying the same amount of plant starts that would come from that seed package. So, for example, a package of tomato seeds might cost $5 versus, a tray of 20, 25 tomato plants is going to cost quite a bit more than $5, depending on where you get it from. It also can help control plant health all the way from day one. It's the best way to ensure strong plants, a strongly developed root system, and being able to adapt to the climate of your backyard. When it comes to direct sowing, some of those root vegetables and fast growers prefer not to be transplanted and to just be planted directly into the soil themselves. So carrots are a really good example of that because we want to protect that root. We want nice long, straight carrots, so we would want a loose soil for that, and that would not do well with being transplanted if it were to be started indoors. So on the right here, I've got this little chart showing just a handful of some examples. Of course, this is not the total varieties, but just some to get you thinking along what different types and families work well indoors versus direct sown out. So the direct sowing outdoors would be better suited for things like peas, lettuce and spinach, radishes, beets and carrots. Could also be beans, corn, cucumbers and squash, and sunflowers. Cucumbers and squash you also can start ahead, but they're strong enough usually to survive being started outside as well. And then some other ones that you might definitely want to think about starting indoors. And this could be anywhere from 5 weeks all the way up to 8 weeks before that last frost in May. So it's coming up soon. Things like tomatoes, those need to be started about 5 to 6 weeks before last frost. Peppers might need a little bit more time, up to 8 weeks. Eggplant, broccoli, and cauliflower. Basil and parsley, some herbs. Those are always easy to grow inside all year round as well. And those might need a little bit more time before you're going to harvest them, as those you want to harvest off of a strongly established plant, and you're just going to take some of those leaves. You can also start cabbage, and sometimes you can work with some onions from seed. Onions I haven't worked with a bunch myself, but hoping to learn more. So, more about direct sowing, what to plant outside. Some things that we just went over, especially suited for our environment here in Southwest New York, are those peas or radishes, carrots, beets, spinach, beans, and squash. Those can all tolerate being directly sown outside. And for some of those ones that we might want to start ahead and then transplant, they need to go outside within a certain time frame as well. And that's just based on when they're going to be able to thrive and support themselves. So things like tomatoes, those could start to get transplanted out around June 1st up through the 10th. Broccoli and cabbage can tolerate up and through early May. And then peppers and eggplants can go around June 5th through the middle of the month. And, if you miss this time frame by a little bit, you can still absolutely get those plants outside whenever you need and just do what works for you, but this is just a rule of thumb generally. So, creating your seed starting setup. Some things to think about for successful seed starting indoors. And you might need to either get a little bit of equipment or find the right spot in your house. Maybe it's not where you would think it would be, but there's generally some guidelines that can help make sure you're going to get the most out of your seeds and the best chance of germinating a strong, healthy seedling. So when we're thinking about our soil, you want to find a good, fine textured seed starting mix. And I recommend to look for a seed starting mix more specifically than just your average potting soil, is that generally those seed starting mixes are a little bit more of a sterile environment, and that's going to be an easier space for that little seedling to grow, especially in an indoor setting. A really easy way to find what to plant them in is to just get one of those cell trays, and look for one that has drainage at the bottom and potentially the ability to do bottom watering. And that's going to help those roots dig down to go find the water. And that can be achieved by just having a cell tray stacked on top of a flat tray with some sides so that you can water into the bottom and let that rise up into the plants. It's also going to help with airflow and then just having a healthier root system as well. Now, specifically for germinating seeds indoors and in a colder climate where we are here in New York, heating mats probably will be necessary. And it's really important for certain varieties too. Some plant varieties just simply won't germinate if it's too cold, even if they have the right soil and the right moisture. If it's just too cold, it's not going to want to grow. And then that leads me to grow lights. Strong, consistent light is the number one factor between strong seedlings and those really leggy, weak seedlings. So, generally speaking, when we have our grow lights, you want to keep those pretty close to the plant. And you want to have them lowered down enough that the plant is only 2 or 3 inches. Oh, it says 23 inches. There's meant to be a dash between those, pardon me. 2 to 3 inches above the canopy, and then raise that light up as the plant grows taller and taller. The closer the grow light is to the plant, the less the plant's going to struggle to reach the light, and so it won't stretch as much, and that's how you avoid that legginess to a seedling. Try to look for ones that have full spectrum LED or the fluorescent grow lights. With light, there's different wavelengths, and the plants need certain wavelengths to be able to actually photosynthesize. And you want to see if you can set a timer or the intensity of the light so that they only receive about 14 to 16 hours a day. If anyone's been around CC Chautauqua in the last few months or so, you may have seen our growing experience with spinach in one of our conference rooms. We did quite an experiment with lots of microgreen trays and spinach, and we found that you can absolutely give too much light to your plants. And what happens there is if you consistently leave on your grow lights, even with a small seedling, you can send it to bolt and produce seeds, even if you haven't harvested off more than two sets of true leaves. So, want to make sure that it's getting some rest time in the dark and not running a full 24 hours a day. Finally, if you don't have any grow lights and you don't want to buy any grow lights and you're just doing this in the windowsill, just remember to rotate your trays so that the plant isn't going to lean towards the light and it'll start to stay that way. Temperature and germination. So I mentioned these heating mats earlier, and this is a pretty typical seed starting heat mat. You can find these online or at hardware stores, and you just plug it in, and it's a rubber mat with some wires inside that gets, warm enough to keep the cells warm. So most warm season crops are going to germinate best around 75 degrees to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember, those warm season crops are things like tomatoes or cucumbers, or corn. Those need that warm summer night, so they're going to need a warmer environment to germinate properly and start strong. Some colder season crops are going to germinate well at some lower temperatures, and that might be able to be something that you don't need a heating mat for, but could just do within your house, which might be between 60 degrees and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a pretty average range for indoors this time of year too. So using a heating mat is going to help maintain consistent germination temps, but it's also going to help activate some of those warmer season crops that are going to need that. And then after germination, you can reduce those temperatures to prevent that legginess. So we don't want it to be too hot for too long down there and cause the plants to want to get away from the heat, but it might need that kick just to activate certain varieties. So we also want to think about proper watering techniques. So this image here is showing that bottom watering method where you have some cell trays stacked in another tray that doesn't have any holes at the bottom. And that way you can add lots of water into the bottom of the tray, and that'll encourage those roots to dig down and find the water and drink it from the bottom. This helps to avoid damping off disease. You want to look for keeping that soil within the medium moist category. So not totally saturated, but also not dry, like bone dry. Especially when plants are small, those root systems are very delicate and they're thin and they need that moisture. They're not strong enough to survive a really long drought, and probably it'll be irreversible if your seedlings dry out. You might need to start again. I want to also make sure that you have enough airflow around the seedling. So you can help make sure of that by including a small fan in the area and just keeping it on a low setting, or having it in an open room, but something that's not super contained. And then using room temperature water only. So all these plants are going to be small, they're just seedlings, or we're just trying to get those seeds to germinate. You might have the heating mat, but always make sure your room temperature water. We don't want it to be boiling hot, and we also wouldn't want it to be too cold and put anything into shock if it's more of a sensitive seedling state. All right, and avoiding common seed starting problems. So, some things that might come up, and I'm looking forward to Q&A at the end if anyone has any particular difficulties or struggles when seed starting, or maybe you've always just bought your starts ahead of time, grown from a store, and maybe this is the year you want to try and start some seeds. I'm definitely here to help answer questions and reach out to me after the presentation as well and stay in touch if you'd like to talk about this. So some common problems that we might see are leggy seedlings. Like I said, so that's when the stem gets really tall and long, but the leaves haven't really poofed out yet. They haven't set out their set of true leaves, and the plant looks a little, weak and kind of pale. That might be a matter of inadequate light, or it could be too much heat. So remember, if you're going to use grow lights, keeping that grow light about 2 to 3 inches away from the plant if you can, and then just raising that up as it grows. That's going to help the plant get all the light it needs right there at the source instead of having to reach up to find it. You also want to think about damping off. So that can be avoided by overwatering and avoiding that really soggy, saturated soil. and you want to know we've got airflow in there. So whether that's some cells, so there's some airflow at the bottom as well, or just properly spacing your seedlings so that they're able to breathe and have that good airflow through the plants. And sometimes nutrient deficiencies come up as well. So once you want to like wait a little bit after those plants have developed before you start fertilizing. You don't want to do that right away. A lot of those seed starting mixes will have everything that you need to grow those seedlings up enough to a point where they're strong to be transplanted. And you can start fertilizing very lightly after two sets of true leaves have proved themselves on the plant. And that's a good point to think about maybe adding something in to boost your soil if you feel that it's needed. All right, so hardening off. 1 week before planting generally is a good rule of thumb to consider. Some people have different preferences, and it's entirely up to you on how you do it, but just some basic recommendations to get you thinking. So, we want to harden off our plants, which means getting them used to that outdoor environment before we put them in the ground fully. So, if they were started inside and then we put them out into a sunny, windy yard on a hot July day, that's going to be quite a difference from our basement with a grow light. So, beginning about 7 to 10 days before you want to transplant them fully in the ground, you can bring your plants outside and just start, usually kind of work their way up. So, start in the shade for about 1 to 2 hours a day and then bring them back in. And you can increase that outdoor time gradually as you go on. And you want to make sure that you've just got them in a protected spot, so not a super windy exposed area, and try to avoid really hot direct sun for those first 3 to 4 days, right? So if they've been indoors, used to diffuse sunlight through windows or grow lights, it's going to be different than outside in full sun. So you want to kind of tamper that on slowly, bit by bit, for those first 3 to 4 days and then bring them in at night until that final transplant. And that might just help get them fully used to that environment before going in the ground so that by the time they go out there and spend their first night in the garden, they're exposed to that environment. The plants have gotten a little bit stronger, grown a little bit more, and are now ready to survive fully outside. So seed viability also comes into play there. So, what seed viability means is just how well those seeds are going to germinate and how well those have been stored from either last season or whenever they were last used, and if they're still going to be able to grow themselves. So, when we're storing our seeds, we want to keep them first and foremost in a cool, dry place. You want to put them in some kind of airtight container. So things like jars that can seal tight, plastic Tupperware containers are always really good to use, maybe Ziploc bags, but something that can have that airtight seal so that moisture doesn't get into the seeds. Of course, it's always a good idea before putting them all out in your garden, direct sown, or spending time with planting seedlings to do some germination tests on them. So the paper towel germination test, which I'll talk about next, is a super simple one to do that most everybody has paper towels at your house. You can use paper napkins or something else similar to that. But that's an easy way to figure out the germination and the viability of your seeds at home. And average viability is going to range by crop, right? So some seeds are a little bit thicker and bigger. Those might be stronger, a bit more built to hold up over the years. And some are a little bit smaller and sensitive and might only have a short window of viability. So things like onions are usually viable for maybe a year or a little bit more, but those would be ones that you want to use up instead of saving for a long, long time. Tomatoes generally can last from around 4 to 6 years. Of course, that viability goes down every bit a little year, but those can last a little bit longer. And then things like brassicas can also last around 4 years or so. And of course, you always want to test those before you plant them just to see if they are still germinating. Which leads me here. So, a paper towel test, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You take seeds and place them in a wet paper towel, put them in a plastic bag sealed. We can maybe leave a little bit of a gap for some air in there. and then place them in a warm area, somewhere around 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and just check back on them for sprouts around 3 to 10 days. So if your seeds haven't germinated after 10 days, that might mean that that seed is a little bit old or got damaged and might not be the most viable option. If you have really strong, healthy seeds, you should see them popping out of their shells like you do in this photo here, sprouting little root systems. They even have a little set of leaves ready to come. That looks like a very viable batch of seeds. And that would be a good way to test, make sure anything that you're going to direct sow into your garden, I highly recommend you just do a viability test. Even if you just bought a fresh batch at the store, you never know truly how long they've been sitting there on the shelf in a package, and it'll save you a lot of headache and time ahead by testing their germination before you direct sow a full garden full of them. That might not actually be viable. So, something easy to do, always a really fun project to do with kids as well and show them, oh my gosh, look at my seed growing there. So, let me know if anyone ends up doing that. All right, and now it leaves us with a little bit of time to check the Q&A. So if you have any questions at this point, go ahead and fill them into the webinar chat or the Q&A, and I will see if I can get any questions here. And if we have no questions, I'll wait a few minutes, but do have one more slide at the end here. So if you have your phone on you and wouldn't mind going ahead and giving this QR code a scan, this is our program evaluation. We really would appreciate your feedback on tonight's program, or if you've attended any past presentations with CCE Chautauqua. And also a link in there to sign up for our newsletters and to get in touch if you'd like more information from us. My email and the office numbers there on the screen if you'd like to reach out to me directly. My name's Eliza. I'm the Natural Resource Educator here with CCE Chautauqua. And thank you so much for joining tonight. I appreciate it, and we'll keep an eye on the Q&A for a few minutes.